if we want to strike or we want to act, you need to understand where people are coming from. Once you get the theoretical framework for what is going on, then it's easy for us to understand how we need to act. There's no need in sitting here going on and on and on. Nothing will happen. And that's the reason why we're here today. Because people have not paid attention to one thing, the past. If we're not going to the past, and I study post-colonial studies, to understand the present, we need to go back to the framework through which the ruling classes have always worked. Now, I'm going to start by putting this in ideological state apparatuses, which are all the institutions, into a historical context. Where do they come from? How do they emerge? What have they been doing over the years? Why is it now in the United Kingdom has this been operating? By the time I start speaking, you will obviously see how the ideological state apparatuses operate. But I will start with my own doctoral thesis, with the work, and that's where I kind of got the idea of the ideological state apparatuses from, because I had to use that as a framework for my own thesis. So in 1956, the Senegalese writer and filmmaker Sembène Ousmane published his first book called The Black Docker, Le Docker Noir, translated into English as The Black Docker. Sembène used various devices from African oral traditions because he needed to tell the story of an African black man walking in the docks of Marseille. So we could see the labor. It's about this man was walking on the during the French, during the colonial era. And this was his own way. It was his own way because he needed to tell a story. As we're over here, how do I expose race relations in colonial France? Very important, race relations. However, this story that he wrote in the book was actually not a fictional one. It was semi-autobiographical because it was based on Sembène's own experiences and of the problems of racism, prejudice, and injustice faced by the African migrants in France. Okay, we're talking about the late 1930s up to the late 1950s, so we're not talking about too long ago. Tyler Stovall, who is an academic and historian, actually wrote about the recruitment of non-white workers in France. How were they treated? He said when non-white workers were in France, they were not permitted to fend for themselves. And these are people who were brought in by the French government. They didn't stow away. They came in because they had fought on the French side during the Second World War. They were not permitted to fend for themselves, but were regimented. Okay, so just kind of look back at the slave plantations. The treatment of African migrants, regimented by the War Ministry's Colonial Labor Organization Service, called the SOTC. The SOTC grouped these workers by nationality into labor battalions, assigned them to their employers, and made all arrangements for their transportation, housing, and food control. The SOTC, they were not allowed to fend for themselves. That meant everything was regimented. 60 years later, because that was racism, because they, used this men just for labor purposes, exploitation. So the money, 60 years later, racism continues to dominate global headlines in Europe. And I brought this paper called The Rising Tide of the White Nationalist Terror. Okay, because this is actually, in the Guardian newspaper, after we had actually spoken about this conference. So it just so happened that I found this as part of, what is going on right now. Because some groups in North America and Europe continue, like they did in the colonial era, to use the discourse of racial ideology. So race ideology is now the framework to oppress non-Westerners. If you're not from the West, then they use this race issue to politically, socially, and economically oppress people. So race becomes the framework. Now, where did this race framework come from? It's not a new ideology, because it dates back to the classical ages. So usually you just go back and say, oh my God, we've used this before. Central to Aristotle, who likened the barbarians as beasts, backward and unintelligent. This will feature in the works of writers who were writing about Africans, people like Conrad, as you know, The Heart of Darkness. Africans were still depicted. So you can imagine this kind of connotation that's been, bandied around. And when I say black people, we're talking about non-Western, because that was used across the colonial world. The whole idea was to use race discourse. Okay, it's called race discourse. Okay, so it becomes evident that there is a link between racism and colonial domination, based on the ideology of the Western bourgeoisie, who used classical discourse, because that's the classical discourse that's been there throughout, as the framework for repression and domination. I'm going to leave it there. So this discourse is still continuing to be used. When I come back, I'm going to now look at state ideology and how racism and that discourse fits into what we call the ideological state apparatuses. That's why we're all here. If slavery was abolished, we would not have the kind of repression. My colleague over here was talking about the entrance of the Africans and the Caribbean coming into the UK. This was also on the French side. So we're looking at the colonial at that time, just around the time Africans were coming into Britain from the Caribbean. We also had the counterparts in Europe, in France, from the colonial, from the Anglo and the Francophone. The whole idea was the treatment of particular people. And remember, I was saying, as Tyler Stovall said, they were grouped into different, so you could see the whole classification. And this is still what is going on right now. It's all about racial ideology. Racism and colonialism were part and parcel of the way of exploitation. Let's now look at that framework.
Second session, right? You're carrying on.
Okay, I will. So I am going to start talking about what we call the state ideology. Okay, and I'm looking at a particular theorist called Althusser, who was just talking about state ideology in Europe and how society works. Because for you to understand how your society works, you have to understand the base. Okay, the state is made up of the ruling class. Okay, every state in this world has a ruling class. It is a law on itself. It makes its own laws. Okay, it is public or private. It's neither public or private. And in addition to the state, you also have what makes society work. And this is what we call the apparatuses, which is where I'm coming from right now. The apparatuses are the things that are daily basis, what makes society work. It's a sociological framework. You have the religious institutions, you've got education, you've got family, you've got the legal, you've got the political, you've got the trade unions, you've got the communication, and I'm going to have to read them out. You've got the political ISIS, which of course makes up the political system, including the different parties. Okay? And I'm not just talking about the UK, but let's think about where we are right now in the United Kingdom. Communication ISA, the press, you've got the radio, and you've got television. Yeah? These are all institutions that make society work. We read things from the radio, we hear things from church, we go to, we've got the family. You also have the cultural, which is literature, arts, and sports. They work hand in hand with the state ideology. Okay? Althusser argues that the ISIS are not as ideological as we think they are. They might look ideological, but he says there is not such thing as a purely ideological state apparatus. This is where I really think it's important we pay attention. Part of the state is linked to state ideology, which is purely capitalist. Okay? Capitalist was what ran, and this was where we started from the colonial, because the capitalist state ideology was racist, because that was how it grouped people. It took the same institutions right into the colonies. If you look at how the colonies were organized, the domination and the repression, using all its apparatuses, legal, political, to oppress. This is where we are at the moment in the United Kingdom. The same rule applies. If the state uses capitalists based on class and race to exert economic and political power, in other words, capitalist-based ideology is repressive. Capitalist state ideology and is encoded into the superstructure of the state's apparatuses. So which means that at school, it also teaches submission to the ruling ideology. You have to obey the state. We have a curriculum. I cannot teach without saying what the curriculum is about. So all agents of production, repression must be in one way steeped in state ideology. So I look at Toni Morrison's essay about white supremacist violence and Trump. It's called Mourning for Whiteness. Mourning for Whiteness. This essay critically examines why white Americans are now using violence, because one of the state apparatuses is also the army. Okay, it feeds into this ideology of whites of supremacy. White Americans use violence at the last resort to affirm their supremacy over non-whites, because they could use any of the institution's ideology. Whatever the state is operating on at that particular moment, which is capitalist-based. Capitalist-based is the whole idea of capitalism is to maintain the narrative production. So why would you allow people who you think are inferior to you rise up? So you've got to go back and use your ideology that we've been carrying on for years. That they're inferior, they can always bring it up at any time. They can invoke it whenever they want because they are in control of the narrative. Capitalism, money talks. If you pay people, the press will also depict. That's why the way the press
is coming out with the stories.
With the stories.
And what they're talking
and what they're talking about.
It comes, what she's saying is it
Because-
comes back to the same story where we are in Britain today.
Exactly. And what I'm talking about is those ISAs. I'm quite happy to elaborate
question and
afterwards.
answer
But
would be
please,
okay.
this is really the driving force.
Because it's ingrained in the
it's
thought processes
of people.
the diaspora communities in Britain, and that's what she's trying to explain. What is this ideological state apparatus? Where do we stand and why we are here right now?
Because it is all in institutions, which is why if you allow people to control the narrative, we cannot control. If we got hold of that narrative,
30 seconds.
we will challenge the ideological state apparatus. And the only way colonialism worked was the racial ideology. That was one of the mission to civilize. If you understand colonialism worked, it was a capitalist based to exploit, to dominate and repress.
I think it starts from the time when Africa was actually trading with Egypt. I think 200, 300, 400 years ago.
But
And
we're
then
even talking,
later
even
on-
the modern, you know.
This is our post 1930s.
Yeah, exactly.
I think your research comes from post colonial.
But even when we even look at the slavery, that was how slavery, but that even in itself, because when you look at what's going on in the United States, the US issue also is all about Trump. Idea to destabilize culture, I mean, any country, is to remove the culture. Once you've taken a culture away from any country, you can do anything you want with it. A lot of people come and because race has been used as that tool. So of course, the moment people come in here, they want to get rid of their Africanness because that was what was used against them. They take on an English identity thinking that that's really what is going to advance the cause. Not realizing that, of course, that is where we now get into the mental issues. Because once you take your culture away and you put on the identity of another culture, you're going to have this, what we call the identity crisis.